Contextual and Professional Practice by Becky Bell. Here is the contents of my PowerPoint presentation. There is a selection of live and personal projects that I have worked on over this module. All of the projects that are not included in this PowerPoint presentation can be found on my Padlet alongside their appropriate research. For Learning Outcome 3, one of the important things was to have a personal responsibility with your own learning throughout the module. This is how I took responsibility to organise my time through these projects that I worked on. I would create overall views for the entire month and then break them down weekly. I also created a lot of to-do lists to help keep myself on track throughout. These can all be found on my Padlet. Here are some of the fundamental research that shaped my entire project, which I will expand on during this presentation. I went to Duplicate Fair and met an artist called Mark Pawson who creates signs and booklets made of offcuts and leftover papers. I also attended Birmingham Design Festival and saw a talk by children's book illustrator Oliver Jeffords, who spoke about recording the human experience. And finally, Caitlin Chan, a comic book illustrator from Hong Kong, who spoke about why she makes personal work, not to be self-indulgent, but to ask questions. One of the live briefs I participated in was a rebrand for CEDIA. CEDIA is a faculty within Birmingham City University, which is a space for diversity in the creative industry. Since their brand was all about making spaces for people that feel like they didn't belong, they wanted that to be reflected in their brand identity, staying away from corporate-looking design. One of their requirements for this project was a warm and welcoming colour palette, which is what I focused on when creating my designs. I started with using the letterpress, but then quickly moved on to creating fun and colourful characters that had no distinct features. This was to help people focus on the text rather than comparing themselves to features that some character design may have. Once I put my designs together, I then created mock-ups of what they would look like on their social media and websites. I presented my ideas in front of the brand, my lecturers, and a small group of my peers. Unfortunately, my designs and ideas didn't make it past this part. In my feedback, they thought that the cutout ideas and materiality of this was nice, and many of the members liked the artsy look and thought the cutout material element is something they could potentially incorporate into their brand identity, but struggled to see how this translated into black and white. This is something I didn't even consider when making my designs because it wasn't mentioned in the brief. From the CEDIA rebrand brief, my contact details were passed on for a project that might be of interest to me. The project seeks a partner for 3 students from India with 2 UK practitioners to collaborate and explore issues of the environment through each other's creative practice and produce new creative outputs together. The application for this was an architecture example which brings me joy, an example of my work, and 2 paragraphs on how I would like to work with the other students already on this project. Here is a small preview of my application for this project. The PDF version of this application can be found on my Padlet. Fortunately, I was successful and this project will be taken through to the master's stage. I'm really looking forward to sharing my practice with others, observing others' approaches and sharing ideas in a collaborative way. This project itself undoubtedly holds potential. This is also a great example of networking. Without taking part in the CEDIA brief, I would not have gotten this opportunity. Was the Northern Illustration Project hosted by the Association of Illustration. This festival is a biannual celebration of all things that is great and about the diverse world of illustration. This year, the festival was being held in Hartlepool, and to celebrate the town's maritime heritage, the theme of the prize this year was the sea. Illustrators were free to interpret this how they would like, but they were told they might want to consider things like how the sea links us. At first, I found myself struggling with ideas and thinking too much about the layout and trying to include as many scene-themed elements as possible. I then had a tutorial with Becky where she directed me in a different way of thinking. She asked me directly, "How do you feel connected to the sea?" Which I then spoke about my yearly trips to Llandudno with my grandparents and how this is my personal connection to the sea. I then started creating lots of different textures with paints, pens and inks and then scanned them in. This is a technique I learned from the book Cut Paper Pictures by Clover Robin. Here is the final submission for the Northern Illustration Prize project. For reference, I used a family photo of myself and my family having a picnic at the sea. One of the things I've come to realise when making work is that I find it more successful when including personal elements. At first, this was something I would shy away from when making work, that already has a defined audience like this, but actually after tutorials I have realised that it's actually a strength and something that I should always consider when taking on a new project. I drew everything out traditionally and then scanned it in. I then used Procreate to bring everything together. After the project was completed, I also used the risograph to play around with the different layers and colours. During this module, I took part as a stall holder at the Blue Moons markets in Birmingham. This market had over 40 different creatives from the UK. This was a great opportunity not only to show off and sell some of my current work, but also network with different creatives. For this market, I had spent some time on the risograph creating up-to-date and bright calling cards to have available at the table with all of my details on. As a shy person, I really had to push myself to talk, connect and network with the other creatives. As a personal project that I continued from the last module, I continued my creative journey and personal growth through the sketchbook explorations and reportage drawings. I would also try different techniques that I learned from other artists, such as the three material challenge from Naomi Tipping. Some of the feedback from my last module was my visual language can be quite busy and sometimes hard to read, so I wanted to try different techniques to help combat this. There is an entire section on my Padlet dedicated to this. It includes lots of reportage drawing, process videos, and even creating my own font, which I have used throughout this presentation. Expanding on my reportage illustrations, I started applying the process to different applications such as zine making. Here is an example of a zine I created. Navigating Amsterdam, illustrated insights from a river's perspective. One of the insightful things about this zine was creating images fast, not being so precious over them as we were sailing past them quite quickly. I then collaborated with one of my classmates, experimenting with the process of putting photographs through the risograph quickly making a zine about one of our trips. This was an exercise to see if we could document the day in a different way than we normally would, playing around with layers on the riso by adding text and drawing to accompany the Polaroids. My classmate later then used this technique in some of his work for his final major project. This is one of the many reasons why I enjoy sharing my practice with others. I then started taking some of the work I had created through this module and putting it through the riso. Some of the work was from live briefs and others personal. Using the riso has become a significant part of my practice and is something I want to take further. I want to continue playing around with the textures, layer and colour. One of the reasons for doing this is that I find the misprints really interesting and can really add to your work. Since throughout this module I've been creating a large quantity of stuff on the riso in the print room and making textures to scan, I had a lot of artworks and textures that didn't really have a function. This is when I thought back to the conversation I had with Mark Pawson and looked at the type of work he made. Completely inspired by his process to repurpose, I then started to use my own offcuts and leftovers in other and turn them into functional things such as badges and magnets. I also learned how to bookbind. They are very messy and rather naive since they were my first attempt, but I'm satisfied with how they turned into functional things and have another use now. I then attended a workshop by MA alumni Ollie Wells called Modes of Interrogation. The premise of the workshop was to help take away control, working with freedom and rules to find a balance and help let go of being precious for your work. Throughout this module, I have taken every opportunity to collaborate with my peers, and this workshop was no exception. I got my classmate Lulu to add some text to some of the illustrations I had created throughout the workshop. As a collective, we then started to put our work together and then pull it apart. It was very insightful to try somebody else's design making techniques. And at the end of the session, Ollie asked us to go away and think about how we could turn these into something functional and give them a purpose. Then faced with the challenge and the problem of turning these collaborative design pieces into something functional or something more, I looked back at my past projects both in this module and the last module and thought about how I would personally work in a situation like this. I started by creating an 8-page sign from one of the pieces of paper. This is something I know how to do well and have spent time teaching to other students in the past. After this, I thought about different paper folding and tried 3 different methods. The first one displayed here is Tato, a Japanese envelope or flat pouch made of paper or card. Expanding on this, I also created a fortune teller fold. I had loads of fun learning new paper folding techniques, and since the workshop was all about giving up control, I felt like it reflected in the new techniques I'd learned. Because I was a newbie, I was unsure of how the images would turn out when folding and their placements. Here are the final results from the workshop. Back to being collaborative, we all worked on the zine together. Since the final piece was collaborative, you had to give up control, pulling and physically ripping each other's work apart and putting it back together. I really enjoyed this workshop because I was really interested in the actual process. I thought it was really interesting and informative and a new way of thinking, and then I started to think about how I could maybe apply this in my own work and my own design process. Here is some of the most fundamental research, not only for this module, but for my didactic as well. I started by looking at Stephen Fowler's book, Stamp Making. I've often used lino in the past to create stamp and textures, so it was really interesting to see different ways to make stamps and the different materials that can be used. I continued my research on stamp making. I went to the RCA grad show and I took part in a small workshop for one of the graduates' final show. This was a stamping workshop. The theme of her work explores the relationship between humans and nature, as well as connections between human and non-human entities. The workshop aims to foster a sense of participation and engagement, allowing participants to feel both a part of themselves and a part of that is not themselves. Participants name their creations, develop personas for them, and share stories about them. Myself, Franklin, and Yifan created our own postbook called Friend. I was also really interested in the Ikai stamping. This is created by the Japanese government to help encourage tourism on trains. It was really beneficial for me to see how stamping and stamp making can be put into different contexts and how it could become a more functional thing. After my initial research on stamp making, reading the Stephen Fowler book and then taking part in the small workshop at the RCA, I started working on a collection of my own stamps, playing around with the process, making stamps that could stand alone, stamps that could be layered to create different images, and making fun shapes and even lettering. I then had a tutorial with Becky and we spoke about how stamping involves communication, messages, and layers of meaning. The concept of stamping is not limited to a single method or process. It's quick, functional, visible, and easily understood. Stamping can be a process of collecting and acquiring artifacts or ephemera. Wanting to add more context to my stamps, I looked at different ways to document storytelling. Firstly, I was looking at Oliver Jeffers' 1 City, 5 Hours project, where he uses his skills as an illustrator to condense the essence of a city into a single drawing, capturing the characteristics of a place. These maps provide added value to content, emphasizing the main characteristics of a place. Now interested in cartography and map making, I listened to this podcast, Art Matters, about the art behind map making. Some of the interesting points from the podcast were talking about early map makers often converted written and verbal knowledge into graphical representations, and maps can be powerful tools for visual storytelling, conveying information beyond more geography and allowing for creative expression and interpretation. Then Matt told me to look at the Bayeux Tapestry, and viewing the tapestry in this context allows us a glimpse of the lives of the women who often look overlooked in history, showcasing different stories. This is when I started to put my stamps into a more context. I attended a workshop in the print room where I learned how to do a map fold, and I created the foam stamps and arranged them in a way to try and tell a story. The story I picked was a trip to Llandudno with 2 of my friends. Out of context, I think it might be hard to understand and hard to read, and it is something I would like to go back and like work on still. But it was really interesting to create the stamps, research how to put them into context, and then actually putting them into context after, which isn't always the way that I work. So it was like really nice change of process. Came the single After creating a lot of stamps that became the single narrative of my trip to London. No, I then thought about repeat patterns and continuous patterns. These are things that I'd learned from reading the Stephen Fowler book. Um, so that's when I created some stamps and layered them and tried out different patterns with different colours just to see what I could create. I was then stuck with the problem of how I could apply my new knowledge of stamp making and printing patterns into my current practice and how I could expand my practice with this new knowledge. I was working on the live Socket to Me brief. The approach I had for this project originally was completely different and has been documented on my Padlet, but then I thought about how I could apply the pattern making that I had learned and things to this live project. I'd scanned in the patterns I had made and stamps, and I applied them to the socks in different ways to get these outcomes. Taking this different approach and different process helped me get to these final designs, which I would not have originally got to before. There is a lot more research on my Padlet and some other live projects that I haven't mentioned in this presentation. That includes the Street Art live brief for the Birmingham City University Student Union, which I collaborated on with a classmate, and then the Art Moves artwork competition where I used AI to help me come up with some ideas. I've also not included some of my personal projects, like all of my lino experimenting with fabric and dry point. I feel like I'd really split my time during this module. I'd split it between live briefs and experimenting with different processes and different printing techniques, and everything can be found on my Padlet, as well as the relevant research. Moving forward onto the master stage, I'm planning on starting an artisan residency in the print room alongside the print tech. I'm really interested in expanding my printmaking knowledge and seeing how I can apply it to my work. Printmaking is one of the ways I try and elevate my own work. I'm also going to be working on the Environmentalist India UK project throughout the master stage too. The problem I had during this module was how I can apply my current practice and skills to a more professional context with live briefs. I feel like I've really spent the time experimenting and solving this problem. By having tutorials and the relevant research, I was able to come up with solutions as well as continuing to share my practice with my peers and learning new techniques and skills.